Welcome to the Listener's Commentary on the Old Testament. Your guide is pastor and theologian Dr. John Whitaker, and the heart behind these studies is to help you better understand the text of Scripture so you can more fully live it out. It's all about helping you learn and live the Bible. Here is the book of Genesis.
All right, welcome to our study of the book of Genesis here on the Listener's Commentary. In this recording, what I want to do is give a little bit of introduction to the book, specifically looking more at like the backstory as well as a little bit of an overview for Genesis. But before we jump into that, let me just kind of introduce Genesis by thinking about some of the big questions that we humans have that I think the book of Genesis speaks into. Questions like, where did the world come from? Why is it here? Where did we human beings come from and why are we here? And why is the world the way it is? Like it has such a complex mix of beauty and disaster, of goodness and evil. And we humans have that same mix as well. Why are we the way we are? We love beauty, but we're so prone to make messes. We crave justice, but we perpetuate injustice. We can identify wrong, and yet we somehow ourselves keep doing wrong. We have this seemingly deep-seated ache for meaning, and at times almost a nostalgia, a yearning for like a utopian paradise, but we've never actually been to a utopian paradise. And yet our hearts are drawn towards that picture somehow as if this nostalgia for something we're missing that we've never been to. Why is all of that? And what is all of that? And can anything be done about any of this? These are the kinds of questions that human beings have wrestled with and explored for eons. In fact, all of our great religions have offered their own explanations of those kinds of questions. Well, Genesis, I think, opens up at this point, offering its own answer to these questions, offering its wisdom for these kinds of questions. So let's just give a little bit of an introduction to the book, a few key facts. Who's the author? Let's start there. Who's the author of Genesis? Well, among Old Testament scholars, there's actually quite a bit of debate, but I don't know that there needs to be. The historic answer, both among the Jews as well as among Christians, is that Moses is the author of Genesis. Even if it's possible that he had earlier sources available to him, which great writer doesn't do some research and have some sources available to him, nevertheless, Moses is considered the author. It's the consistent assumption and testimony of the Bible itself. In fact, it's what Jesus believed about Genesis, that Moses is the author. And so I just take that at face value. Who's the author of Genesis? Let's just go with Moses, even if there's maybe bits and pieces that he didn't himself write. Now, when was it written? What's the date for the writing of the book of Exodus? Well, the best understanding of that is that Moses wrote it during the period of the Exodus. In my estimation, that puts it sometime in the 1400s BC. So that's the rough date for the book of Genesis. Now, let's talk about the original setting. Genesis itself is composed of two big sections. So Genesis 1 through 11 is creation and early human history. We don't know the exact date for all of that, but that's roughly what that period is, creation and early human history. Then Genesis 12 through 50 covers the story of Abraham and his family. And that period roughly covers 2000 BC to 1700 BC. That's when Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were living and operative. So 2000 to 1700 BC is Genesis 12 through 50. And as we continue thinking through the original setting, we need to think about sort of the geographical setting for that. And so we need to start that with Mesopotamia. In our introduction to the Old Testament, if you haven't listened to those, you might want to check those out. We talked about kind of some historical geography, and the place names and regions you needed to know about for different periods of Old Testament history. And for this period that is recorded in the book of Genesis, the first major region is Mesopotamia, which literally refers to the land between the rivers. Mesos in Greek is middle of, patos is river. So it's the land between the rivers. That is the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. That's Mesopotamia. And that's the key region for the early period of Abraham's life. It's the region where the southern part of that is where Iraq is located today. The northern part of that is where Iran is located today. That's the ancient region of Mesopotamia. And Abraham left his hometown of Ur, moved northwest to a city called Haran, which is sort of like on the eastern edge of modern day Syria. And Haran is where Abraham lived for a handful of years. It's where his father died. And then it's from Haran that God called Abraham to leave for the land of Canaan to the southwest. All of this takes place in what is known to us as the Fertile Crescent. If you Google Fertile Crescent, you'll actually see the region that we're talking about on a map. And the Ur that Abraham left is most likely, we're not 100% certain, but most likely the well-known Ur from archaeology, which is located right near the northern tip of the Persian Gulf along the Euphrates River. And back before the time period of Abraham, it had been this powerful and wealthy city. We have archaeological finds that indicate their educational environment, their political climate, and a very developed and wealthy, large, prosperous, powerful city. That was Ur, but by the time of Abraham, it seems to have been a city in a bit of decline. And Abraham, along with his father Terah and the whole clan, moved out of that to Haran and then was eventually called down to the land that God promised to give to Abraham in the region of Canaan. That's the other area that we need to know about for reading the book of Genesis well, is Canaan. It was a region of land that's roughly located where modern-day Israel is now located. And it was populated in Abraham's time with various tribes who ruled in city-states that were like cities that sort of function like their own independent kingdom, or they were nomads and traveling throughout the land. It was this land that God promised he'd give to Abraham's descendants through Isaac and his offspring. And then to the south of Canaan lay Egypt, right where modern-day Egypt is today. So those three regions, Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Egypt, are the historical backdrop for the book of Genesis. Now, let me offer a short summary of the book of Genesis. Genesis opens with the familiar words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's where the story opens, and God creates all that exists and forms it for life and fills it with life. And the grand finale of God's creative work in the creation account in the book of Genesis is the creation of human beings. And he made human beings in his image to reflect God and carry forward his work and his rulership over the earth, and to do so in partnership with God. But these human beings, God's image bearers, succumbed to temptation in the garden, chose to go their own way. So they broke faith with God, their creator. Sin and death thus entered into the world, and the world then lay under a curse. And sin and death continued to spread throughout the world, wreaking havoc on a world that God had created beautiful and good. In fact, it got so bad that God had to make a strategic and tragic decision to cleanse the world by flooding, washing it with a great flood, and to start fresh with a man named Noah. That gets us up through the first 9 chapters of the book of Genesis. Well, after the flood with Noah, humans' sinfulness didn't cease. It continued to spread throughout the world even after that. So God called a man named Abram. We know him better as Abraham, but originally his name was Abram, and he was going to be the one through whom God would reverse the curse of sin and death and bring his blessing, not just to Abram and his family, but to bring his blessing to all the nations of the earth. And so right from the get-go, God's plan of redemption and rescue has the whole world, all the nations of the world in view. And even though Abram and his wife Sarai, whom we know better as Sarah, but originally her name was Sarai, Abram and his wife Sarai were old and had no kids, God promised that in due time they'd have a son. And then through that son, they would have descendants that were as numerous as the stars in the sky. And it was through these descendants, these offspring, that somehow the whole world, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And Abram, the text tells us in Genesis 15:6, believed God's promise, and God counted him righteous. Well, the story is long, and we'll get into all the details as we walk through the book of Genesis. But in due time, actually 25 years later to be exact, God did fulfill his promise to Abraham and Sarah, and they had a baby boy. And that boy grew up to be a man, and one of his sons, Jacob, who was nicknamed Israel, became the father of a bunch of sons who became the heads of the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. And the last section of the book of Genesis is all about Jacob's son, especially one son in particular, his son Joseph, and how God used Joseph to rescue Jacob's whole family and to bring them into the land of Egypt, which is how the people of Israel ended up in Egypt at the beginning of the story during the book of Exodus. So in short, Genesis is about where the world came from, how it got the way it is, and what God is going to do about it. Now, let's give a little bit of a kind of maybe a more detailed breakdown of the structure of the book of Genesis. There's various ways you could do that, and we'll give sort of a kind of an overview here in a couple minutes. But let me just highlight one little detail that a lot of Bible scholars have noted about the book of Genesis, and that is that the author seems to have arranged his thoughts around, at least one way he arranged them, is around this Hebrew word, toledot. Toledot. In English, it's written Toledot, toledot. And it's a word that gets translated generations, or it gets translated account, and it shows up multiple times in the book of Genesis, and it seems to be at least one of the organizing principles for the book. So, for example, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, you get, these are the generations, these are the toledot of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. This is the account of, or these are the generations of. Something like that is what is being said. You get it again in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. This is the generations of Adam. This is the account of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. You get it again in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, concerning Noah. This is the generations of, or this is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, so on and so forth. You get it a little bit later when it says, these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We get it specifically for Shem in Genesis chapter 11, verse 10. These are the generations, or this is the account of Shem, and so on. You find this structure, this phrase throughout the book, and it seems to be one way that the author of Genesis, Moses, organized his thoughts. And usually it points forward, it seems, to what follows it. So what follows is going to be an account of, a story of what happened when God made the heavens and the earth. This is the generations of Adam, and it tells the kind of the linealogy, the genealogy of Adam himself, and so on and so forth. You even get that at the end of chapter 11 with Abraham's dad, Terah. It says, now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot, and so on. And so now we're going to get the account of Terah, that is ultimately the father of Abraham. And we'll get that all the way down through the book. For Ishmael, for Isaac, for Esau, and for Jacob, we get this sort of Toledot structure. So as you read through the book, you might see it generations, you might see it account. Some translations, unfortunately, translate the word in a couple different ways, and you lose that structural marker, but it is one of the structural markers for the book of Genesis. Now that gets kind of complicated and detailed, so let me offer a little bit of more simplified overview of the book. There's really like three big parts to the book of Genesis. The first part is chapters 1 through 11. That's sometimes referred to as primeval history. It's the early history of humanity from creation through fall, through flood, and up through the Tower of Babel. Primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11. The second part of Genesis is Genesis 12 through 36. This is where you get the patriarchal narratives, patriarchal history of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Genesis 12 through 36, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the book of Genesis ends with the story of Joseph in Genesis 37 through 50. So narrowing down its focus onto one son of Jacob, the son Joseph. And by the time we get to the story, we learn how he becomes a ruler in Egypt and how that then is a way God uses his experience and his story to rescue his people. So you get the Joseph narratives in Genesis 37 through 50. Those are the three chunks, 1 through 11, primeval history. 12 through 36, patriarchal history. 37 through 50, the Joseph narratives. Now within that, obviously you have a little bit more detail. So chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, creation of the world. Chapters 3 through 5, the fall into sin and the spread of sin and death. Chapters 6 through 11, the cleansing of the world by flood and yet the continued spread of sin. That's what you get in primeval history. Then in the patriarchal narratives, you get 12 through 24. That's the call in the life of Abraham, Genesis 12 through 24. Chapters 25 through 27, that is Isaac and the line of promise, 25 through 27. 28 through 36, that is Jacob and Esau and their families and the continuing line of promise now through Jacob. And then Genesis 37 through 50, Joseph and the being sold into slavery in Egypt and becoming the servant of Potiphar and all of that whole story with Joseph that leads then to the sons of Jacob and Jacob's whole family moving down to Egypt. That's an overview of Genesis in a nutshell. And Genesis is a fun read. There is some interesting stories, wild stories, some crazy stories. And we just have to remember that as we read a narrative like the book of Genesis, you don't read narrative the same way, say, you read poetry or the same way you read didactic teaching. It's a story, but it's not just history, it's theological history. And it intends as a very selective account to ultimately show us what happened to the world, what happened to mankind, and the beginnings of how God is going to solve that problem of sin and death through Abraham and his descendant. And as we watch Abraham's story unfold, one of the key themes to pay attention to theologically is what is the line of promise and how God preserves and protects that line of promise and how then through that line of promise, God ultimately is going to use that to bring his blessing to all the nations of the earth. All right, that is a short overview of the book of Genesis and a little bit of the backstory to Genesis. Hope that's helpful to your reading of the book. We will dig into the details in the recordings to come. Thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the Old Testament. As always, the Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that is only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support and for making the Listener's Commentary possible. God is using this ministry all around the world in ways that sometimes exceed anything I could have imagined or expected. And I am so grateful for those of you who make this ministry possible. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can do so by going to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button, or signing up for the Study Hub. Either way is a great way to support this ministry and help it continue to reach more and more people with the message of Jesus and the story of the Bible. God bless you. Thanks a ton for your support.